Hi, everybody. I would like to first ask you to turn off your cell phones, please, for a short while. We will talk to you about this question: do game developers want a union? But before, we will have a few information to give to you. As many among you may know, in 2004, the IGDA launched its Quality of Life Survey in an effort to gain a much clearer understanding of some employment issues. Of course, crunch time and compensation issues, but other ones as well: state of the industry, satisfaction at work, project management, etc. So who are we? We are Canadian professors in labor relations doing research on work conditions in the video game industry. In 2009 and 2014, the IGDA partnered with us to develop a new version of the Quality of Life Survey to process and analyze its results. The video game industry is an object of unrelenting criticism, as you may know, about its working conditions, often accused in social media of treating its developers poorly. According to the latest 2014 Developer Satisfaction Survey of the IGDA, 32% believe there is a negative perception of the industry, while approximately a quarter remain neutral and 42% believe that there is a positive perception of the industry. In considering some of the factors that might lead to the games industry having a negative perception from the public, it's interesting to note that working conditions was the top response, before sexism in the games and perceived link to violence. Interest of these IGDA surveys is they allow us to compare 3 milestones in the young life of the industry. What we basically aim at here today is to take stock of the evolution in the industry's issues and of working time in particular. We'll present some trends and perceptions of the working conditions among developers because this is the grounds for any collective action like unionizing. First, we have to wonder, is there a problem, to be able to discuss the action issues afterwards. For these reasons, we are here talking about developers' results only, including freelancers, indie developers, etc., but we do not account for managers and leads' results to have only workers' point of view. Now, turning to the big issue of working time. We can observe a general decrease of the regular working hours in the long run. I don't know, can you see well? We can observe a general decrease of the general working hours in the long run between 2004 and 2014, meaning that there is an increase in the 35 to 44 hours bracket between 2004 and 2014. A bigger share of respondents has this duration instead of the longer ones. Hence, there's an improvement in the working conditions in a certain way. There's a decrease in the longer duration categories during the same period, which just mirrors the same trend. More respondents in short durations, beginning of the green line on the graph, less in the long durations, end of the green line. When we turn to the declared actual duration of the crunch time, it shows a more distributed set of frequencies in 2014 and a decreasing trend towards less respondents working more than 60 hours a week while in crunch. Though clear, this trend is contradicted by a constant share of respondents working 80 hours and more a week, showing a constant hardcore of studios practicing intense crunch. To have a better picture of the practice of crunch, we have to account for the number of weeks in a year during which developers are asked to work in crunch. Comparing yearly weeks of crunch time shows first and foremost a clear increase in studios that work without crunch time. So the difference at the starting point of the lines on the slide here shows the difference, which demonstrate that it is possible. The question of actual weeks working in crunch was nearly ignored in 2004, so we can only compare actual weeks of crunch between 2009 and 2014. Data shows also that crunch time for less than 5 weeks is more widespread, while 5 to 9 weeks is less frequent, such as all the longer durations of crunch. Let's note as well that in 2014, more respondents are working in crunch for less than 15 weeks a year. That's the green line on the left side. When we add them up, they make 65% of the respondents. In 2009, the red line on the left side, they made 60% of the respondents. So there's a slight improvement in yearly duration of crunch time, according to the IGDA surveys. Now, 10 weeks of crunch is still 20% of the year and can challenge health and other aspects of your life. How many respondents are in this situation or worse? If 40% were in this situation in 2009, less than 22% are in 2014, which shows a certain progress. Now let's turn to the weeks of crunch in a row. Here again we can observe an improvement. You can see that the red line is higher than the green one at the left side of the graph, meaning more respondents are working less than 15 weeks in crunch in a row in 2014 than in 2009. In fact, close to the whole sample is in this situation in 2014. Same thing if we take those who are working less than 10 weeks in crunch in a row. We have more in 2014 than in 2009. Again, this is an improvement, of course, but more than 2 weeks in a row is still much and can challenge health as well. 5 weeks in a row is much worse. How many respondents are in this situation of crunching for 5 weeks or more in a row? 37% in 2004, 30% in 2009, and 17% in 2014. Moreover, if close to everyone was crunching in 2004, 9% did not work in crunch at all in 2009. Now it's close to 25% that do not crunch. That's a quarter of the sample. Now, still, 3/4 of the sample do crunch, which is very important. Are they compensated? So after somewhat good news, in a certain way, now we have to address the dark side that remains. The continuing problem of crunch time is not only a problem of time, but a money issue as well, as it is often unlimited and unpaid. There may be some sort of compensation, but they are not guaranteed, and there is no assurance that it will be proportional to the number of hours worked. The criteria are discretionary, so are the benefiters. In 2004, we can notice that half of respondents don't get any compensation for working beyond normal office hours. This proportion is decreasing throughout the following period. The proportion of respondents who are paid at premium rate or get time off during crunch time, though very small, is slowly increasing, while the proportion of those getting bonuses is noticeably decreasing. In 2004, we can also see that two options, time off and bonuses, make up for 36.6% of the sample. This aggregated figure is mostly the same in 2014, but includes far less bonuses than it used to and more time off. Moreover, the perks option, most of the times perks is free dinner ordered, is the most strikingly increasing. We must not forget the fair share of respondents that do not get anything out of crunch time. They're 28%. If we combine perks and nothing at all as compensation, roughly 60% of developers are not compensated at all in 2014. Directly linked to the former question is the estimation that one is sharing in the profit of the studio and the success of a game. In 2009, the same proportion felt they were sharing in the profits as those who did not. In 2014, much smaller share of respondents feel they share in the profits, while a bigger share do not, which shows a considerable deterioration. Now we would like to draw your attention on some very concerning upward trends in the quality of life. People were asked if they agreed with, after work, I'm too tired to do some of the things I'd like to do. So you can see that there's a 5 points of percentage augmentation. And it's the same for the following. People close to me complain that I am preoccupied with work when not working. My work interferes with my ability to spend time with my family, and the tension of trying to balance work and home life leaves me emotionally drained. And afterwards, we have some stable trends and some very high figures. So we decided to present them to you because they're high and they're stable. Here, as we are dealing with stable trends, we did not care to show close to similar figures for the 2 years. So bear in mind that these figures are roughly the same for both years. If we add up these figures with those of the former slide, this pictures a likely committed crowd, but people who long for free time and some quality of life. What's not shown here either is that 83% of the respondents are dissatisfied at the bonus compensation system in 2009. This proportion has not decreased much in 2014, where it's close to 80%. What's worse is that if they lack free time, half of the respondents in 2009 and 2014 as well do feel they have more work than they have time to do it, so they lack time to do their work as well. Is crunch unavoidable? Since the 2009 survey, respondents are asked this critical question in the trade. We used to consider crunch the necessary evil in the trade. But is it? It looks like developers are more and more critical about this issue. In line with ongoing discussions held around the necessity of crunch, the results were obviously mixed. While 27% agreed or strongly agreed that crunch is a necessary part of game development, close by a double disagreed. In 2014, the share of respondents who agree is smaller than 20-something%. So the propensity to consent to the necessary evil theory is going down and down. Canadian interviews we have conducted last year among 100 developers in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, I don't know if some of this crowd is here today, supports the flawed management thesis far more than the necessary evil one on the matter of crunch time. Moreover, while developing their argument, 20% spontaneously referred to crunch as being dangerous and inefficient, presenting both health risks for developers and quality risks for the product that can end up costing more than the budget spared on wages for unpaid crunch. Is crunch unavoidable? Those who consider crunch to be part unavoidable, part avoidable, hold a rationale that can be summarized as follows. It's summarized on the slide. Uncertainty is part of any project, as many of you know damn well, due to simple facts. First, each product is new and original, and thus the production process is at least partly unheard of. Second, some inherent technological constraints provoke unforeseen feature creeps, scoping issues, glitches, and bugs, and thus add to risk. And third, when a studio is part of a chain of subcontractors, it depends on others' timekeeping. So the later your part comes in the process, the bigger is the risk of belatedness. What they consider, our Canadian respondents, is that better management, planning, and scheduling can reduce crunch hours a lot and keep them at a reasonable level, but could not eliminate all of them. But as soon, and I'm quoting, as soon as it gets out of control and beyond reasonable limits for health and private life, it's an outcome of mismanagement. I'm summarizing their thought. Our respondents know what they're talking about because they often work in studios that ban the practice, and the very existence of such studios supports their position. Some respondents are knowledgeable in time management in projects and can set forward some successful experience in evidence-based, realistic time planning. Some do have indie game projects of their own as well. So they compare their game-making process to their studios. We collected much stock on this that would lead us far beyond the time if we got into this, but we'll write on this later. But the interesting point to note here is the rising skepticism facing the necessary evil theory. And lastly, I would like to draw your attention, now that we've seen that there are some real matters of dissatisfaction, on the means of action. To face all of this, developers take some actions. They do. For instance, thanks to a very dynamic job market, employees will leave quite easily when disappointed, or use the threat of leaving to negotiate individually, like a pay rise, a participation in a coveted project, a conflict over the management, or a project, a conflict over a project, or over the credits. Developers make fair use of the social web and internet to mobilize troops when studios misbehave. But it still is first and foremost whistleblowing. Bad publicity can hurt and foster enhancement in the future, can even play a disciplinary role among studios, but the benefits come forward in the long term and rarely benefit the whistleblowers themselves. Class action was somewhat rewarding in the EA Californian case following EA Spouse, but at the end of the day, EA moved to Florida and Canada, having a very cooling effect on the developing crowd who could wish for mobilization. IGDA can set some standards for contract models and grievance procedures, but at the end of the day, those standards are all based on goodwill, are never imposed, and do not have any coercive powers on studios' managers. So I'll leave you to my colleague Johanna for the following.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Josée. So all of the data that Marie-Josée has presented so far, and there was quite a bit of it, so thank you for bearing with us in presenting sort of that background case. Those questions lead us to ask the questions that you see here on the slide. Are the current protections, the current systems that exist for developers to address their workplace challenges sufficient for them, sufficient for you? Or do you want something else? Something more, something potentially stronger, something perhaps that's beyond the professional associations that exist, beyond the trade associations that exist, or even beyond the individual legal actions that are currently available to game developers. And in the context of a workplace, a structure that is typically something more and typically something stronger is a union. So before we get right to the question, I just want to step back one step and make sure that everyone is on the same page with roughly what a union is and how unions are different from structures that the game industry already has. So what we've presented here are three key features of unions. First, unions, of course, are collective and not individual structures. They're organized associations of workers where individual rights are subsumed, at least in some part, in the rights of a larger group. And so that makes unions the representative agents of these workers, and the workers become their membership. Second, unions, as the representative agents of their membership, operate with the needs of workers, the interests of workers, as their top priority, their primary priority. So they act to protect and promote the rights and interests of the workers that they represent in a variety of different ways. And different unions do that in different ways. They engage in different practices and different approaches. Third, and perhaps most importantly in the context of this discussion, is that unions are a legal entity whereby employers are obliged, they are obligated to negotiate. And in the terminology of our field, we call that bargaining. So employers bargain with the union to create legally binding employment contracts, and we call those contracts collective agreements. So in that context, the union and the employer jointly negotiate acceptable terms and conditions that govern a particular set of workers. It's something that they come to together. So this list of features of what unions are distinguishes unions from employee associations such as, for instance, the IGDA, which don't have the legal recognition and status in collective bargaining with employers, and therefore doesn't have the legal teeth to enforce sanctions against employers or the power, as Marie-Josée already indicated, to dictate binding terms to employers. This list of features also sets unions apart from trade associations, such as, for instance, the Electronic Software Association in the US, which act to promote the industry overall, but often have a much more business-oriented approach. And so, that said, there can be substantial overlap between those three bodies, those types of bodies, unions, employee associations, and trade associations. Because unions, for instance, often engage in quite developed professional development opportunities for their members. And unions as well often engage in general boosterism and support for the industry of which they're a part, on which they depend in many instances. But specifically, the mandate of putting the workers first and the legally binding obligation of employers to engage with the unions are core features then that give unions a particular focus and a particular strength. So if we get right to the question, do game developers want a union? According to data from the IGDA Quality of Life Survey in 2009, and then from the Developer Satisfaction Survey from last year, it would seem that there are a considerable number of developers who are interested in a union. So the survey question that was asked was, if a vote were held today to form a union at your company or studio, how would you vote? And this data, again, represents only non-managerial respondents, so just people in core development roles. So in 2009, we see that 35% of respondents said that they would vote yes for a union. And in 2014, this number grew to almost half the sample. 48% of people said that they would vote yes if a vote were held today for a union. So in both surveys, roughly a third of respondents weren't prepared to respond. They either preferred not to say or were undecided on that question. And we don't have it shown on the slide, but as well in the 2014 data, 48% of the sample expressed that they would be more comfortable raising workplace problems through an employee association as opposed to as individuals, where they had to take on that challenge just by themselves. And so in both the 2009 and the 2014 survey, there were also a broad range of other questions, many of which we've presented in the first half of this talk. Questions around hours of work, compensation and benefits, job security, and general feelings about work and the workplace. And we dug down a little bit more into that data to see if it had any bearing on the feelings toward unionization. And we found that developers who expressed feelings of job insecurity were much more likely to say that they were willing to vote yes for a union than developers who weren't feeling a degree of job insecurity. And so these are people who responded to a variety of questions. For instance, people who felt like they would not be able to find another job with comparable pay and benefits without having to move if they lost their current job. People who had experienced layoffs in the recent past. People who were worried that their job wouldn't be there next month. And also people who identified as part-time workers were all in this, this group of individuals who we would say had more job insecurity. We also found that developers who felt that their compensation was not equitable, either for their job responsibilities and abilities, or also for the amount of crunch that they were being asked to do or required to do, as well as developers who felt like their raises were tied to rather arbitrary decisions of management, or developers who received no raises at all as part of their compensation package. All of those types were more likely to vote for a union than not, so sort of dissatisfaction with pay overall. We also found that developers who felt that there was no clear career path for them and no opportunities for promotion or advancement in their studios were more likely to vote yes for a union. We looked at the difference among broad sort of disciplinary categories among game developers, and we found that programmers were the least likely to say that they would vote for a union compared with other groups in in the industry. So people in roles like art and audio, design, and then if you include the quality assurance, localization, user experience roles, those groups were all more supportive of unions than the programmer population. And finally, we also found that developers are much more likely to vote for a union, and this is not surprising, but much more likely to vote for a union if they felt that their coworkers were also supportive of that idea, or at least that their coworkers were not unsupportive of that idea. So if a developer felt that their coworkers would vote no, they'd be more likely to also vote no. But if they felt that their coworkers would vote yes, or perhaps even that their coworkers wouldn't vote, they would be more inclined to vote yes. So there is a peer effect going on. We tested a number of other relationships, and we found that there weren't relationships in some areas that we might have expected. So for instance, studio type didn't seem to matter in this question. So whether you worked for a publisher or a third party or an indie didn't seem to have bearing on whether you would be more likely to vote for a union. We also found that gender variables didn't matter, ethnicity variables didn't matter, age or years in the industry didn't seem to have an impact, and past participation in the IGDA events didn't seem to have an impact either, either positively or negatively on your inclination to vote for a union. So overall, the data suggests that there is support for a union in the video game industry, particularly for people under certain circumstances. But we also found through our interviews with game developers in Canada and through our reviews of the many articles and blogs that are out there on the topic that there's a wide range of understanding about unions and what unions actually do or could do. And so there are varied opinions on the perceived fit of a union with the game industry, and we'll turn to that a little bit now. So there are legitimate concerns that game developers have with a monolithic or perhaps stereotypical view of what a union is. In our interviews with game developers in Canada, we repeatedly heard this list of concerns. So unions are typically associated with seniority systems. And for many developers, this is something that they oppose. In a creative industry that's linked closely to the entertainment business, this idea of advancing through pay structures and advancing through promotion opportunities based on years of service just doesn't jive quite well most of the time. As well, we heard that seniority systems for awarding or assigning projects also doesn't really fit in an environment where there seems to be a high value placed on youth, and there seems to be a very high value placed on individual merit and effort. Similarly, we heard that seniority systems do not fit well with a highly mobile workforce. And indeed, any system that bases rewards on time spent at an individual single employer are not very suitable in an industry like game development where there is a lot of movement among employers and among studios. It's a common criticism of unions overall, really. Why would you work hard to establish a union at your workplace if you're not going to be there for very long, and therefore you won't reap any of the benefits of the hard work that you put in? We also heard that unions might slow the industry down in terms of adding structure and perhaps bureaucracy to the process. And this was perceived as a bad thing. There was sort of a gut feeling reaction from many of the developers that we spoke to that unions are just sort of bad for creativity and innovation. And this is sort of a common sentiment that people hold. And another major concern that we heard was that unions would make workers too expensive. And the industry would decline or move overseas in search of cheaper labor. And to tie in with sort of the final point on the slide, this makes sense. This sense that unions would raise cost is of particular concern for the sort of startup side of the industry, and also for people that are in roles that may be perceived as more vulnerable to outsourcing. So roles like quality assurance that might be more easily sort of siphoned off to a lower labor cost area. All that said, many interviewees talked about how unions would set up or could set up systems or structures that would help to protect workers. And we heard developers say positive things about the need for more equity in pay, based on gender, based on years of experience, based on the roles played in the development process. We heard that unions could be important in enforcing less arbitrary decision-making in studios. They could provide more job security for workers, clearer job roles. That might also be something that was important. And also in terms of seniority, there is a talk happening at GDC as well. Someone's talking about sort of the ageism that is a little bit rampant in the industry. And so there are aspects of a seniority system that might actually be positive for the industry if it can help to recognize the value that comes from long experience and perhaps eliminate a little bit of the reinvention of the wheel that sometimes happens when you're always working with a new workforce that is making the same mistakes over and over again. So it's important to note here that though not all unions are the same, and many unions look very different from the traditional or stereotypical unions that represent workers in manufacturing plants, not all unions are like that. Not all unions have to be like that. And one key difference among unions is their structural or representational form. So this distinction is very important for our discussion of unions here in this context because it can address some of the concerns that developers might have about unions. So let's first consider a model that might not fit, and it's this model of enterprise unions. Most people think of a union representing a group of workers at a single workplace, and it is the more common form, and it's the form that's most supported in the legal system. So this union bargains with a single employer about the terms and conditions of work at that workplace. And we call this enterprise bargaining or enterprise unionism. And in this industry, in the game development industry, it would be like every studio having its own union, and the union then bargaining with the employer at that studio about the terms of work and issues specific to that studio. So we would argue that this union form is not a particularly good fit with this industry. Because the industry is so project-based, because there's such a high mobility of workers, and because there's often a very high interdependency of studios. So for instance, what would happen in that context if a worker is moving between unionized and non-unionized workforces on a repetitive basis? How would you, in that context, bring together a team of workers, perhaps where some were unionized and some were not? It poses a bit of a challenge. As well, this model is a poor fit with industries like game development that are highly competitive and where product development carries great risks. So if one studio were to unionize, the new terms and conditions negotiated at that studio might very well put that studio at a disadvantage compared to other studios that were not unionizing, particularly if those studios are competing based on labor savings and not based on things like quality or innovation of the project. That said, there are some important examples of what we would call industry or sectoral unionism that might be a better fit with the industry. So for instance, in this model, there's a single union that represents the workers across the entire industry, regardless of where they work or who they work for. And then that single union would bargain with a consortium of employers. We would call it an employer association. And they would set minimum standards for working conditions across the entire industry. So this model better allows for portable rights for workers and also helps to mitigate against the disadvantaging of single studios by adopting consistent minimum standards across the entire industry. And as an example, most unions that currently represent workers in the creative, cultural, or entertainment industries that are sister industries to game development in some respects are industry unions like this. So beyond their structure, these unions and the employer associations with whom they bargain have worked to address some of the concerns with unions that game developers also raise. So things like the importance of merit, the importance of flexibility, and the importance of individual negotiation beyond minimum standards. So if we take the collective agreement of actors, for instance, as an example, there is room in those collective agreements for superstars. There's room for people to negotiate above the minimum standards where they are able to do that individually and garner that individually from their employer. There's room in those collective agreements to institute a recognition and a reward system that allows for and acknowledges the importance of individual merit. These collective agreements have also worked, particularly over the last number of years, to put in clauses that account for small startup projects. So there are often clauses in these collective agreements where there are reduced demands, lower wage scales, for instance, for projects that are independent or startup, to recognize the challenge with capital for those industries, for those sort of startup businesses that just can't pay the regular wage. That said, even in that context, industry unions are still a challenge for an internationally mobile workforce because they remain national structures. So that remains a challenge for game development as well. So if we go to this slide, many game developers themselves already acknowledge this difference between industry unions and enterprise unions and acknowledge that the one might be a better fit. So after we asked the more generic question that I presented earlier, the developer satisfaction survey followed up with a more specific question about how respondents would vote if the union was going to represent workers and negotiate issues across the entire industry. And the response to that question was even more in favor, with a greater percentage voting for the union and a smaller percentage voting against the union. So if you could recall in the slide previous, 48% would vote yes for an enterprise union and 24% would vote no. Whereas here you see, when we talk about an industry union, 64% of the sample now is in favor of a union and only 14% would vote no. So, in conclusion, among all the comments we've heard in our Canadian interviews, there are many interesting and sound analytical comments about unions and unionism. There are lots of very knowledgeable game developers and very thoughtful game developers on this issue, which is a tricky issue. We don't have time to account for them all today, although some of it might come up in the questions and discussions. But one thing is sure, and we feel confident in making the conclusion that many game developers are definitely interested in a type of collective action when their interests as workers are at stake. But there's a demand for change that's embedded in this, and there's a challenge embedded in this that is addressed to contemporary unions, and it's also addressed to governments as the makers, the lawmakers of labor law in this country and other countries. And the challenge is to change and rethink the main model of union organization, which is this enterprise-based bargaining model. And we need to rethink that and think of a model that can better address the needs of a much more mobile workforce like yours. And so a workforce that is increasingly engaged in project-based work and mobile landscapes. So we think we've spoken enough. We have an hour session, but we didn't want to take up all the time ourselves because we'd like to use the rest of the time to engage in dialogue with you about these issues. Because we'd also suggest that there's a challenge here directed at game developers from this data. And even after this brief presentation, or what this brief presentation has shown, it won't fit for game developers to just select a union off the shelf, fully formed. What is needed, even with the example of the entertainment unions, game developers are going to need leadership and momentum and time and thoughtfulness and careful consideration of their common interests, of your common interests, to think about what a labor movement would look like in your industry that would be useful or important. So we're happy to open up the floor. We're happy to also take your comments through social media, et cetera, on this issue. We also just want to remind everyone before we get into a bit more of the informal discussion that all of this data, all of this very rich information is made possible through you all filling out surveys, which we recognize is not always a wonderful and amazing thing to be doing. But if you didn't already know, the IGDA has the 2015 Developer Satisfaction Survey launched on Monday. They actually launched it in 7 different languages, which is kind of exciting. So it's open right now, and you can go to the IGDA website and follow this link and take the survey and provide more data. But let's open the floor to questions and comments.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. So I was curious, just because there's such a high degree of turnover in the industry, which is kind of related to what you mentioned, the project-based nature of the games industry, what do you think of a kind of a guild system? We're not legally, most developers aren't legally classified as independent contractors, but you don't need 300 developers over the course of a project on the project at all times. And in some ways, the guild system seems to fit the industry more than a standard union. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, it's there is a degree of sort of membership in the union as the entry point to an industry. It's a little bit more like a construction union tends to have this model where the union becomes the hiring hall, if you will, that then studios who are interested in acquiring high quality talent go to that hiring hall to bring on members onto their team. And that tends to support that idea of a transient workforce much more, where the stability piece in the industry is the union. And in that context, unions often spend a lot of time on professional development because they want to be able to make the claim that we're giving you superior workers than accessing workers from the non-union pool. So in that context, you would sort of make it as a game developer by getting your union card that would then give you access to the better projects, the better studios. And that model does have a bit more space for addressing people who are not going to be permanently employed in perhaps any capacity or for any amount of time.
Great.
Yeah.
What was the name of that model, or what should I Google later?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example out there is like the building trades tend to do that the most. I don't know that it has a name.
Maybe the movie industry
does that a lot.
The model is the same, but the aspect of job control is having less and less power during the recent decades.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you collected a lot of data from the developer standpoint, and unions are a two-way street. It has to be accepted by both the workforce and the employers. So if you have a circumstance where 100% of the developers want to be in a union, but none of the companies want to hire within a union, you're at a deadlock where the system doesn't really work. That's one of the fears I have about forming this kind of union is we're in this system where everyone's kind of satisfied with how things are going, and shaking the system can make people unhappy. Have you collected any data from the management side of development and their interest or concerns or feelings on unionization?
I have some numbers.
Yeah. It is a tricky question because there are two ways to answer your question. On a legal standpoint, the opinions of the employers are not taken into account by organizations like the National Labor Relations Board, for instance, because if the employees in a majority want to form a union, there comes to be something like an obligation to negotiate in good faith. But we know pretty well, you and me, that the employers are not without recourses because the capital, the venture capital, is mobile. And all in this audience know this. Everyone knows about it. So this is a very delicate balance. The question of making a survey among employers to know what they think about it is one thing, but I think you will agree with me that you have an idea what the answer can be, but there never were a majority of employers wanting to have unions. Some live well with it. But it's not only a matter of knowing what they think, but it's a matter of what would they do if this was. And I think you have situations in which you have many options for employers and some others not.
There is, in anticipation of this question, so thanks for asking, I did just jot down, because in the surveys we had all sorts of people took the survey. And if you took the survey yourself, you know there was a long list where you could choose what your role was. So we can isolate management responses as well on these same questions. For the more generic industry union question, slightly less, but not ridiculously less, numbers of the management team would be in favor, and slightly more than developers would be not in favor. But it's surprising. So particularly for the industry union data, 64% would vote yes of the game developers themselves. Just isolating the manager sample, which includes leads and includes producers. So there's a bit of cross-contamination in the data that's unavoidable because your industry is the way it is. But 62% of that management sample also said that they would vote yes for an industry union, which frankly was a little wild. It was a little unexpected for us, I think, in that context. Now, we also asked questions, what do you think your management would do in response to a unionization drive? And there were people who said that they would be aggressive and threatening and that kind of thing. But I was surprised at the numbers. Yeah.
Thank you.
There was some recent news from the Obama administration that they were going to raise the maximum salary in the U.S. in which you were eligible to receive overtime pay. And there were talks that this would be dependent on geographic location, so that would account for the higher cost of living in places such as California. I was just wondering how you thought that would affect the game industry, and more specifically, what kind of effect that would have on attitudes towards unionization.
Across the board, in this data and also in any data of workers, dissatisfaction with pay is a strong driver for wanting a union. Unions are associated with pay raises. Even though a lot of unions out there don't place their primary emphasis on pay raises, and unions are often quite conscious of the ability to pay of their industries that they're embedded in. But definitely, if there's a piece of legislation that makes your situation better, that eases your restfulness about engaging in some other form of action. So that's a possibility, right? Lobbying governments and getting legislative change that also better fits the current environment in a more modern workforce is an approach as well. And allowing legislation that is more supportive of mobile workers, precarious workers in various scenarios. But employers are clever about how they classify workers. And there are often loopholes. And I mean, that was the issue in the EA, the big EA lawsuits, back in 2004, that it was really kind of a technical classification issue of how these workers were classified. And the workers essentially had to decide, do you want to be paid on salary and then get no overtime, or do you want to sort of be downgraded in your classification and get overtime? there is that bar there around salary that often usually impacts the higher paid workers in the community more, which usually are programmers, which is why I think you see a little bit more interest in unions from the lower echelons where they're not going to make that bar in any case. I don't know if that answers your question very well. Did you want to say more?
I would say that maybe more important than the hourly rate of pay is the overtime pay. So it's a state legislation, so it varies a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a couple of questions, but first of all, I wanted to say something about the puzzlement over the management being so interested in, at least, I'm a member of a Hollywood guild, the Writers Guild of America, and have been for a long time. We don't call producers management. There's above the line and below the line, and producers, and even though production managers are called managers, they aren't really. The people that we negotiate with are the suits, not the people that are working in the studios. And that could be why that number feels kind of skewed. One of the things you said I found really interesting, being a member of and just for everybody, even though I'm in a writers guild, we have collective bargaining, we have everything that was on that list describing a union, even though we're not exactly called a union. You said there was some of your data said that there was a fear that unions stifle creativity. And I found that really bizarre, and I wondered if you could go into that a little bit. Were there comments possible in these so people could explain why they would think something that I find very odd?
I might defer to you, Marie-Josée, because most of that is coming from the interviews that we conducted, where you can get a richer response. Lots of people, that's their gut reaction. Unions are bad for creativity, because there's a sense that they impose a structure and an inflexibility that is somehow anathema to creativity. I don't agree either. But a lot of people carry that notion around.
And it's mostly a question of having a seniority system that encourages to keep up with people whatever good they are, and it's linked to meritocracy. It's linked to a system that would promote to keep better people and to get rid of the not so good people. So it's survival for the fittest ideology based on what people see around them of unions. It is their perceptions.
Yeah, they're seeing, I think, more enterprise unions than industry unions, right? And there is no seniority provision in the Writers Guild whatsoever. You just have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
People are relying mostly on what they have seen among their teachers in high school. They are providing many examples of dissatisfaction in this regard. It is a gut feeling. It is not based on information oftentimes. And I know pretty well it's the same in Quebec. We have an artists' guilds, and they don't have any seniority. But it is a perception of what is the mindset. And you have.
Thank you.
And ultimately, unions are what their members want them to be. Good unions are what their members want them to be. And that's on the members to hold your union accountable to that and to make your union fit your industry. But there are lots of unions that are working among professionals, working among creative types that, Hollywood's still making pretty good movies.
Now, maybe this is getting back to stereotypes again of unions, but my feeling is organizations which have unionized, where they becomes like a gulf between the management and the staff. I work in a small company. there's a very strong sense of us all being in this together. You know, the owners of the company are, you know, because we're so small, they're on the front line with the rest of us. And I wouldn't want that sort of sense to be lost. So I'm wondering, is that just sort of a stereotype? Is that something that is a risk? Is that something that there are examples of unions where that hasn't happened?
I don't think it's a stereotype all the time. I think there is a traditional adversarial attitude that unions have in many respects that's grown out of where unions grew out of, which was in industries that were, you know, manufacturing-based, industrial, primary resource, where there was a gulf, a legitimate gulf between management and workers. There are many unions, though, that exist where that is different. And there's a tricky issue of who is included in the union and who is not, and where are they in the hierarchy of the organization. That's a challenge. I think in some ways, I would argue that when you have an industry union framework, it takes a little bit of that pressure off, because in your small studio, you wouldn't be sitting down every 3 years negotiating your contract right there in your organization. There would be sort of a master agreement that you would work under. So it's a little bit more removed, which might ease that tension a little bit. But it can happen. And I think what's sometimes hard for us to realize is that there is a difference between management and workers. There is. Especially when, you know, management in larger studios in particular have a different role to play. They have a different stake. They're protected in different ways because they're managers or they're owners. And I think there's a realism about that difference. And as much as sometimes we are trained to think that we're all pulling together, we're not always pulling together in the same way. So but it's a challenge. I totally would acknowledge that that's a challenge.
Thank you.
So there are only 5 more minutes left. Maybe what we could do is take all of your questions and then we'll respond once, and that might be faster so we don't miss anybody.
All right, I'm part of an independent company. There's about 5 core of us, and I wanted to know, you touched briefly about how an independent studio might interact with the union, but I wonder if you can go in a little more detail about that. How would we be able to approach them, and how would it be affordable for us to do so, and so on?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm a programmer, and I was curious if any of the responses you got from programmers that seemed less likely to want to form a union had any explanation about that. I remember reading an essay about it last year about the idea of programmers not needing a union, but to treat their work more like a profession, like doctors or lawyers. I was just curious if you guys had any insight from the work you did about why programmers would be opposed to forming a game developers union.
Basically, my question comes down to, like, what would be the step if developers did want to form a union? What would be the first step? You know, you can go join the Wobblies, but that's not really necessarily helpful on an individual level. What would that look like if developers did want to start organizing in that way? Thanks.
Okay. If I can start, you may take the second one. I think for indies, the affordability question is a fear. And I admittedly don't know the total ins and outs of some of these relationships, but I do know that, say, on film projects that are lower budget, those projects qualify for sort of a different rule set that takes into account that there is only this budget because it is a small project, or it's an art project, or it's an innovative project, it's a startup, whatever it is. Then you kind of fall into a bracket that accepts that idea and doesn't want to squash the ability of people to produce good work just because they don't have millions of dollars. And so that's something that you just negotiate in your agreement, that you say, if your project is only going to be of X budget, then you play by these rules. And these are the wages that you can pay, as opposed to if it's a bigger budget, well, then you fall into this bracket. Maybe that line becomes a little arbitrary, but you can do things like that. You can engage in creative, whatever it is, to address some of those challenges. I'm going to defer to you. Okay. On programmers, there's there's more data from IT workers, and programmers are often seen as more like IT workers, and there has been research on sort of the cultural identity of IT workers who are perceived to be more individualistic. Those workers tend to be most powerful in the organization and are most likely to say, I can negotiate what I need on my own because I'm in high demand. I don't need you. I can get what I need. Whereas other workers that are a little bit more vulnerable because of their skill set may not be kind of the most in demand, don't experience that. So there are different aspects, but I'm happy to get in touch and I can point you to some articles furthering that sort of discussion around IT workers and programmers in general. Yeah. What would be the first step? You could call up a union, but I think what's more useful for game devs at this point is to take a slightly longer approach, and start talking amongst yourselves and decide on what your common goals are. What is it that you want? Because if you can't come up with a community of interest, if you can't come up with a common set of values, it's not going anywhere. And through those discussions that may take a long time and a lot of effort through some key leaders, you can sort of come to terms with what you're interested in, and then think about, maybe there is a union out there that could rise to the challenge of what you need. Maybe you need to devise it yourself. We're done, I think, but why don't we can go. It's true. We are happy to go to the wrap-up room, which is in 2002, if people want to talk more. But thanks very much for coming out.
Thanks.